the conversation was conducted, they kind of do sound like high school kids.
Yeah. The Guardian of London, which really loves to stir the pot, claims that this was not a mistake that Mike Waltz made, but it was rather sabotage by MI6, which loathes Trump and everybody around him and is trying to embarrass them. You have any thoughts about whether this was honest error, a PR stunt? Remember, this fellow Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic was used by Dick Cheney very effectively to write propaganda pieces in favor of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Honest error, PR stunt, or sabotage? Any thoughts?
I think it's possible. It's one of those things that you can't reach a judgment on until you have the evidence. My gut instinct when I first heard about it is that Mike Waltz is a neoconservative. He's basically owned by the lobby, and he is surely talking to Jeff Goldberg. Jeff Goldberg is probably the most prominent journalist who is pro-Israel. So it's hardly surprising that Waltz would be talking to Goldberg. And I would imagine that he inadvertently, Waltz did, or somebody on his staff inadvertently included Jeff Goldberg in the discussion.
All Waltz would have to do is acknowledge that, and the story goes away. And the arguments about espionage and incompetence leaves the front page. But all of their obfuscating, take a look at this nonsense. Mike Waltz trying to explain himself to Laura Ingraham, who looks like she's about to grill him, and then, of course, she becomes one of the team. Chris?
So your staffer did not put his contact information. But how did it end up in your phone?
That's what we're trying to figure out.
Okay, but that's a pretty big problem.
That's what we've got the best technical minds, right?
That's disturbing.
And that's where, I mean, I'm sure everybody out there has had a contact where it was said one person and then a different phone number.
But you've never talked to him before, so how's the number on your phone? I mean, I'm not an expert in any of this, but it's just curious. How's the number on your phone?
Well, if you have somebody else's contact and then somehow it gets
someone
sucked
sent
in,
you that
it gets
contact.
sucked in.
Was there someone else supposed to be on the chat that wasn't on the chat that you thought was?
So
on
the person that I thought was on there was never on there. It was this
who
guy.
was that? What person?
Well, I'm not. Look, okay. Laura, I take responsibility. I built the group.
Okay.
So.
I never heard of this sucking analogy that he used from one phone to another. And of course, it's absurd to think that the two of them have never spoken to each other.
Yeah. It feels
Jeff Goldberg is furious. Listen, I'm not a fan of Mr. Goldberg for a variety of reasons, but he is furious, and rightly so, that these people are trying to throw him under the bus.
Yeah. Which I would just add to the conversation here. There's this word that seems to have gotten lost in our vocabulary. It's called accountability.
Yes.
Nobody's accountable for anything anymore. I mean, you would think that somebody would be held accountable for an egregious mistake like this. You know, the level that Waltz and Hegseth and those folks are operating, you're in a no excuses sir world, right? The national security of the United States is at stake. Your job is to protect this country, and you're not supposed to make mistakes like this. Again, a no excuses sir world. And when you make a mistake like this, you're relieved of your post, period. There's got to be some accountability. But there's no accountability in the American system, which is one of the reasons, only one of the reasons, that we careen from one disaster to another.
Right. Moving on to Ukraine, Professor Mearsheimer, the president claims, the Russians don't reveal how these things are going midstream, at least they haven't been, but the president claims that there's been progress in the negotiations. I have no reason to dispute that, but at the same time that he says there are progress, that progress is being made in the negotiations in Saudi Arabia, the Europeans are offering to provide a security backup to replace the United States in Ukraine. This is mind-boggling. It's not even feasible, is it?
It's mindless. It's not even a serious possibility. Right. It's not even a serious possibility. They simply don't have the capability. You talk about the Europeans. The Europeans are a bunch of different states which have different.
All right. So Germany, France, and Great Britain. I mean, what remains of the British Army wouldn't even fill Yankee Stadium. I don't know what Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron and Frederick Merz claim they're accomplishing. They may actually be damaging the negotiations if Vladimir Putin takes them seriously. What would happen to them if they occupied a portion of Ukraine as some sort of a security guarantee? The Russians would demolish them.
Yeah, the Russians have made that clear. I mean, it's just not going to happen. This is, the sort of craziness that's coming out of Europe, mainly out of the western part of Europe and mainly from Britain and France. I wouldn't throw the Germans into that mix. I'm not sure the Germans would put forces in there. The Poles have made it clear they won't put forces in Ukraine. The Italians have made it clear they won't put forces in. And the British have hardly any forces to put in there. So I
would think that whatever the ultimate resolution is, Vladimir Putin is going to stick to his original demands, and that includes no security guarantee for Ukraine, no NATO, no forces there. And anything short of that, he's not going to agree, and they'll just keep fighting, right?
Correct. That's correct. And I think let me put it this way. It appears that the Trump administration is willing to accept Putin's main demands.
Right.
One of which you just described. There are two others, of course. But it looks like Trump is going down that road. If you look at the ceasefire discussions in Riyadh, we basically played Santa Claus with the Russians. It's really quite striking. If you look at the terms of this maritime deal, the Trump administration was very generous to the Russians. Now, the ceasefire or the wheat deal or the Black Sea deal is small change compared to the really key issue of whether or not you can satisfy the Russians with regard to their principal demands on Ukraine. But nevertheless, Trump is going down that road. It's hard for me to imagine he's going to turn around now. And once you go down that road, you basically have to make the concessions that the Russians demand.
When will the Russians stop acquiring real estate?
Well, they haven't even conquered. It's very important to emphasize this. They have not even conquered all of the territory that comprises the 4 oblasts that they have annexed. So one would think that maybe by the end of the summer, maybe a bit before then, they will have reconquered, or they will have conquered all the territory in those 4 oblasts. Then the interesting question becomes, what additional territory will they take? Will they take Odessa? Will they try to take Kharkiv?
I'm thinking of the conversation that I was uniquely privileged to have with Foreign Minister Lavrov. And when I said to him, this is before Secretary of State Rubio came out with some sort of an agreement for a 30-day ceasefire that was agreed to with President Zelensky. This is long before the 30-day ceasefire, or I don't know how long it is, for attacking energy infrastructure. This is long before the maritime cessation of violence. Would you accept any kind of a ceasefire? Looked at me and he went, what would we, when we are like this, holding his fingers an inch and a half apart? Sort of a universal signal of we're that close to achieving what we want, which is what you have articulated. How close are they to having physically conquered the 4 oblasts that they set out to seize, which in their view is really part of Russia?
Well, they're very close. But let me just explain the relationship between a ceasefire and a meaningful peace agreement. The Russian view is we have to get a meaningful peace agreement on the table, and everyone has to agree that we're going to implement it before we have a ceasefire. The Trump administration, on the other hand, and Zelensky want a ceasefire now, a comprehensive ceasefire, and then we'll work out a deal. Do you see the relationship between?
Of course.
Okay. And what the Russians are doing is they're agreeing to these itsy bitsy ceasefires, like we're not going to attack energy infrastructure, and we're going to reinstitute the wheat deal in the Black Sea. But the Russians are not agreeing to a comprehensive ceasefire. That's what Lavrov is talking about, because the Russians have a vested interest in continuing the fight and putting the Ukrainians and the Americans and the Europeans in a worse and worse position. so that they get leverage at the bargaining table.
Right.
So till Trump agrees to the principal demands of the Russians, I believe you're not going to get a meaningful ceasefire.
And who knows how much longer the Ukrainian military can last, no matter what weaponry the Trump administration continues in I'll call it the Biden pipeline, not to demean Biden, but he's created it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's hard to imagine that Trump is going to go back to Congress and ask for more largesse so that we can keep the Ukrainians fighting. And in fact, I think Trump will tell the Ukrainians, for purposes of gaining leverage over them, that he can't go back to Congress. The votes are not there. So they better wrap this up before they run out of weapons.
I think that's a truthful statement, that the votes are not there, even though Republicans control both houses of the Congress, and the votes are just not there. Is the United States preparing for war against Iran?
I think we're preparing for the possibility. I don't think we've made a decision to go to war against Iran. And I think if the Trump administration has its druthers, or at least President Trump and the restrainers in his administration have their druthers, we won't. But as you know, the Israelis are putting a huge amount of pressure on us to go to war. And he has all sorts of people in his administration, people he foolishly brought in, who are basically neoconservatives and are joined at the hip with Israel. And they'll put enormous pressure on him as time goes by to attack.
Everybody in that Signal chat is an open and notorious Zionist. Every single person, including Tulsi Gabbard.
Because they have no choice. I mean, this is America.
Well, let me ask you this. Can Donald say no to Bibi?
He can say no. Yeah. I mean, he's not running for re-election, and he can say no. Will he say no? Everything that's happened since January 20th, when he took office, tells us that he won't say no, because he's been doing Israel's bidding since then.
I guess I should ask, can President Trump say no to Mrs. Adelson?
Well, it's the same thing, because Mrs. Adelson and Prime Minister Netanyahu are basically joined at the hip.
Well, Professor Mearsheimer, thank you very much. Thanks for allowing me to go across the board on all these topics. It's always a joy to be able to pick your brain, and I hope we can get together for a meal one of these days. We'll figure it out like we did not too long ago.
I look forward to that, and I look forward to being back next week.
And as do I. Thank you, Professor. All the best.